Hello, I'm your host, Mike Gelb, and this is the Consumer VC Podcast, where we discuss the intersection of venture capital and consumer innovation. And if you're enjoying the show, also subscribe to my newsletter at theconsumervc.substack.com. All content and episodes are for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about aVenture, a new platform that's about to launch that's making venture capital available to the masses. It doesn't matter if you're accredited or non-accredited. aVenture provides an opportunity to diversify your investment portfolio and invest in private funds. If you're a fund manager, the aVenture app also provides everything you need in order to make startup investments, including extensive research materials, seamless transaction processes, and allocation measures so you can properly diversify your portfolio. Now, typically, venture capital and startup investments are liquid, which is a major pain point for our industry. aVenture is fixing this by offering periodic withdrawals for its investors. I and many others in this industry are so excited about this launch. They are preparing to list their first fund in the beginning of next year. So if you want to be the first to know, join their waitlist at aventure.vc. Our guest today is Annie Kadavy, Managing Director at RedPoint Ventures. RedPoint partners with exceptional entrepreneurs starting at the earliest stages of the climb. Some of her investments include Tend, Shash, and SIlk Sonder. We discussed her introduction to entrepreneurship and building things in her garage and patents, as well as tiptoeing the line throughout her career between operator and investor, and the business model she's intrigued by and which are actually investible and make sense for venture capital, in her opinion. Without further ado, here's Annie. Annie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. How are you?
I'm so great. How are you?
I'm doing terrific. I know we've had this on the books for some time and really excited that we finally made it happen.
Yes, likewise. I'm super excited to do it.
So what was your initial early attraction to entrepreneurship going back, way back in the day?
Back in the day. My dad was an entrepreneur. I increasingly think of him as kind of an inventor. He was not, we didn't grow up in Silicon Valley. It was not the type of technology entrepreneurship that I kind of live and breathe day to day now. But I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and I watched my dad invent a lot of cool things. Some of them were big, some of them were small, but it was like in the garage building cool stuff. And this kind of idea, and in some ways I'd say like respect and appreciation, but it was even greater than that. It was like admiration at the deepest kind of childhood level of creating something new out of an idea that came out of your head. Was when I really, really think it through, like that's where the genesis was for me. And it was always something I aspired to do.
If it was something that you always aspired to do, maybe what was like your first whack at entrepreneurship? Like, what was that like?
There were some like little like kid things, they were like pre-college. In high school, I filed my first patent for. I played a lot of soccer growing up, and it was for people who have maybe played soccer. You have your shin guard that goes inside of the long sock that comes up to your knee. As you get you play more and more, you want smaller and smaller shin guards because they kind of bother you, and then you would end up like taping them on. And so I made these soccer socks that you had like a Velcro pouch inside so that you didn't have to deal with like taping them on and off. And we filed a provisional patent for that. Funnily enough, Nike, within about 5 years, put out a very similar kids product that was like a shin guard inside of a sock. And I realized that my provisional patent was not nearly done well enough to go and like file any sort of claims against it. But it was one of those moments where I was like, oh man, I was like so close to something incredible. But it was a really cool thing to, come from a personal experience, go and like figure out how to get this thing made, get it out to, some friends who were using it, use it myself. So it never became a big business by any means, but that was my first time kind of going down the path.
That's super cool. What was also when you were the first time maybe you thought about technology as well, and kind of what kind of sparked that interest?
I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and I moved to California to go to college at Stanford. And I don't think I'd ever said the words out loud, venture capital. I certainly didn't know really what it was. And entrepreneurship to me was something like very creative and big and kind of undefined. It could be in any number of industries, any type of entrepreneurship. It was really like the idea of creating something new. And so technology is one avenue. Now I view it as a primary avenue with which to build these types of businesses. But it wasn't until I was an undergrad at Stanford where you can almost not help but be exposed to that. It's just everywhere, right? And you're sitting in the middle of Silicon Valley down the street from Sand Hill Road. Your speakers are many times entrepreneurs or venture capitalists themselves. Like it really kind of whacked me over the side of the head of like, oh my gosh, this is this amazing thing that I just genuinely didn't really know existed. So that was the first time I really, I think, understood how to build that type of business. What types of people, what types of qualities, what types of experiences and skill sets it was required to build something like that. The first time I ever took I guess I had some internships, I worked at some startups, but the first time I ever took a hack at it myself was and the tail end of my time at business school. A few of us tried to start this company, or rather we did start this company called BetterSitter that was a marketplace that connected childcare providers with, parents that were looking for childcare. I had been a babysitter myself for literally 10,000 hours. And so at the time there was like a quote up there about, go and solve a problem that you've spent 10,000 hours and like deeply, deeply understand. And that happened to be a problem that I deeply, deeply understood. So we went down the path of building out kind of a V1 product to go solve that problem.
What were some of your learnings about what during your time at BetterSitter and actually, it was no longer, just kind of part-time or just, in high school and maybe middle school kind of thinking about just different kind of products to launch, but actually you're actually dedicated this as a full-time business.
Yeah, I think I can answer that question through two lenses. One is kind of as a human, how did it feel to feel like I was fully all in doing this? And then the second would be about the business or model or the conclusions we came to or the things we learned, maybe a bit more tactically related to that business in particular. On the first, it was terrifying. Mostly is how I would describe it, because and I think a lot of founders feel that way the first time around, and maybe second, third, fourth time around too. Though, as with anything, it's a muscle I think that people build. But it feels you're very exposed. It feels very vulnerable. You very quickly start to learn the things that you actually know how to do, or the things that you maybe thought you knew how to do, or the things that you actually didn't even realize you didn't know how to do that you would need to figure out how to do. And that is daunting because you also have, kind of by definition, tabula rasa, like the world is your oyster to go build this thing, and you and your team are responsible to figure out what are we going to do first, second, third? How are we going to do things first, second, and third if we ourselves are not capable? For example, like I couldn't code up our first website. We had to figure out a way to do that. I was not an engineer by background. So there's that journey, which is, I think, for me and for a lot of founders I've come to get to know over time, quite personal. And it's like very human. Because it feels like you're really exposed, and you're taking a big risk that is like very intricately tied to your own kind of purpose and identity. So there's that journey that I think is maybe not unique to me. And then the journey that was related to this, specific company, we were trying to build a marketplace that was localized, both supply and demand, right? If you're thinking about what's the nature of like, you're finding a family that needs a human being to come into their home and take care of what probably is their most valued asset, their children. What are the types of trusts that go into that transaction? How can you build both new supply and demand, geo by geo? That's hard, that's expensive. But most importantly, what we realized was that when you do your job really well, people churn off your platform. So how do you get them to stay? So we went through that journey, and then ultimately just I thought it was going to be too big of a hill to climb. Like I felt like I looked 7 years in the future or 10 years in the future and was like, oh, this is fundamentally a very challenging. I'm not sure I'd say flawed, because there are a couple of companies out there, Care.com and Urban Sitter being two, that have built models around it. The problem is not flawed at all. It's very clear. It's very pervasive. I'm now a parent. And I feel it even more acutely than I did before. But yeah, right. I'm like, I would do anything to find a childcare provider. And if I find one that's good, I will not share it with anybody. Like, anyway, we went on that journey and realized how challenging it was going to be. And so we decided to, shut it down and move on.
It was actually not maybe having the, in terms of what kind of the reason why you shut it down, or the reasons that why you found it, we were thinking 5, 10, 15 years down the line, about this business, wasn't so much actually building like the robust kind of pool on either side of the marketplace. It was more so about, okay, people were fine. Like we were actually making great matches, but actually people were churning off super quick after you kind of make those matches. Is that roughly right?
Yeah. And we learned there's two types of childcare. There's predictable childcare, right? You need somebody Monday through Friday. You need somebody every Tuesday night. You need somebody every Saturday night, and you also have childcare providers, of which I was one, that are looking for that, right? They're looking for, these are the hours I work every week. I can predict my schedule. I can build around it to do whatever other things I'm doing. That's the bulk in terms of hours. That's not the bulk in terms of need. Need is actually, oh my gosh, this, I just had somebody cancel, or something just came up. I need somebody. It's acute, right? It's not the kind of chronic planned thing. It's the acute. I need somebody to help me right now because I've got 2 little kids under the age of 5 and I really need to go somewhere else. And my partner is out of town or something, and so we tried both of those and debated kind of which one of those are you trying to go to, and the willingness to pay and how people think about paying. Do you pay on a monthly basis, on an annual basis? Do you pay for kind of a one-off match or transaction? Is pretty different. And so we kind of navigated our way through that a little bit, and we never touched bottom on it. This company called RedPoint that was started right around the same time. This was now over 10 years ago. What I had heard about it from another investor actually at the time, and they were 3 or 4 people. Also, they were launching a product. Like, it was kind of uncanny. Within 6 months, part of this was that the Facebook graph had just become available, so you could actually start a network very quickly and see which parents were also using which childcare providers. And that was a really important trust proxy for who was going to book whom. So we ended up packaging up what we had learned. Mostly what we had built was not that valuable. And I went to San Francisco. I remember I drove and sat down with Lynn and said, I desperately want this business to exist. Babysitting was what had funded kind of a big part of my college experience and high school before that. And I was thinking about it at that time in my life from the, caretaker side of things. Now as a parent, I realize I doubly would like for this business to exist. But it was important to me. It was important to me on some really fundamental levels. And we kind of gave them everything. We talked about do I join the company early on and help them build it? But at that point, I'd kind of become clear enough on my conclusions about how I thought it was going to scale and my challenges with it that I wasn't ready to continue to commit kind of more than 100% of my time to it.
Got it. So after BetterSitter, what were you then thinking about career-wise? Because I know that's how you, I guess, got into venture capital, right? After BetterSitter, but was that always on the back of your mind, VC, or what was kind of your thought process?
VC, as mentioned, I had never thought about it or heard of it until college. I've met people now since that are like, oh, when I was 7 years old, I wrote my famous person report on a venture capitalist, and I always wanted to be a venture capitalist. I'm like, wow, that's incredible. But I didn't grow up in that environment. So I had one, I guess, internship of sorts at a venture capital firm called SV Angel, which was a pretty prominent seed fund in around 2010. A guy named Ron Conway, who's a kind of prolific angel investor, had this seed fund. It no longer exists in the same way, but I had been wanting to start a company, and I had a couple of friends who worked there full time, a couple of the partners. And so I said to them, hey, can I help you look at your deal flow? And I'll try and help sort it for you. And for me, the value was I have no idea how to build a pitch deck, but one day I'm going to need to. Can I learn, through volume of seeing a couple hundred of these things? That had been my only real exposure to VC before. And so when we decided that BetterSitter was not going to be the thing that we'd once hoped it would be, I had an offer to return to Bain, where I had done management consulting before, that I decided I still was going to turn down, because I had kind of like tasted this entrepreneurial journey and it was just too exciting to not want to do. But I had financially a lot of financial aid that I needed to figure out. Starting a company with that also on your back is, for me, kind of past my own personal risk threshold. And so I had a short list of companies I thought I might go join. And they were, consumer, early stage, Series A mostly. And I had this short list, and I went to a couple of people who I had met along the way who were full-time VCs, like on Sand Hill Road at big firms that, you've heard of, that I now know who they are. And I went to them and said, hey, I'm thinking about joining one of these companies. You're a VC. What do you think? What am I missing? And one of them, who I'd gotten to know through this class at the GSB, asked me what at the time was a really profound question, but was kind of funny now. He said, well, this is a great list of companies. What might you do there? And I was like, never crossed my mind. I have no idea. I just thought the company is so amazing. Like, clearly this company is going to be great. You can put me in anywhere, coach. Like, I didn't really, I had, honest to God, not ever thought about that once before. And he was like, well, it seems to me like maybe you'd like being on the VC side. Have you ever thought about that? And I remember this conversation clear as day. We're sitting at this cafe in downtown Palo Alto, and I looked at him like, you must be out of your mind. I could never be a VC. I'm like a young woman with no real operating experience. I've never run a big company for 10 years or anything like that. At the time, Ellen Powell was like that whole story of how she was coming out of Kleiner, and there was some like really bad, very public conversations going on about kind of diversity in venture, specifically women in venture. And this firm and every other firm I talked to were exclusively men who were older than I was. And I just kind of looked at it and didn't really think twice, and was like, of course, that's not a place for me. But then, had some more conversations, and ultimately ended up going to a venture firm, which I then spent the next 4.5 years kind of working through my own imposter syndrome of being there.
What were, I guess, your initial, what like kind of area were you initially hired for as CRV in terms of where you actually spent your time?
CRV is a great firm. They've been around. They're one of the oldest venture firms. I think they've been around at this point well over 50 years, which is pretty incredible for a venture firm to have kind of managed through that many iterations of what it means to be a venture capitalist. So I was hired on there to do quote unquote early stage consumer. And like that was the one line job description. What was consumer was kind of to be defined. And I was given, I think a very long leash to go meet a whole bunch of companies in a whole bunch of sectors with many different business models, and kind of learn as I go.
That's awesome. And I know that you've had, a few hits there with ClassPass and Patreon, which is incredible. So you're in VC, you're working at CRV for a few years, one of the most famous, funds in venture capital. Why did you decide to leave?
I decided to leave for a couple of reasons. Two reasons. There were two reasons. So I was there for 4.5 years. Reason number one was that I had observed through some of the people at CRV, which were a mix of operators and full-time investors, or rather former operators, full-time or former full-time investors, but also like seeing the boards at other companies. And so investors from kind of other firms that I'd gotten to know over time. I had observed that I thought the people who had some operational experience, they spoke to founders on kind of a different level. Like they could drop into this operating hat level and kind of meet the founder where they were in a different way than the folks that I saw who had only been investors, or pretty much exclusively only been investors. Not to say you have to do that. Like if we were to look at the, just define as you will, best investors out there, you're going to see a full range of kind of what their backgrounds were. So this didn't seem to me as like a necessity, but it was something I wanted to do and something that I thought would make me a better investor. And so that was number one. Like when I came to CRV and said, "Hey, I'm gonna leave." Two things you need to know. One, I'm leaving without knowing what I'm going to do next. I'm not going to another venture firm. That is not my intention. Number two, I'm going to join a company. I don't know exactly what I'm looking for. I've got some ideas, and I think that it's going to make me better. My working hypothesis is that I will come back to venture in the future, but I really think that now is a really great opportunity for me to go and try on a totally different hat and learn, climb a different learning curve that, I don't know where I'm going to land. I think it's going to bring me back to venture, but it very well might mean like I might find that I love being an operator at a X size company, and who knows, either way I should go sort that out too. So that was the primary reason to go. And I think that the second reason was I had learned a lot along the way. And I think in venture, as you learn and get better and more importantly, like hopefully get lucky with some of your early investments, you get to kind of evaluate what's important to you in putting a venture firm together, and what that looks like. And I wanted to go kind of explore what that looked like, either maybe starting my own, joining some friends who had been talking about it, understand kind of what's under the hood of other venture firms because I'd only been at one before. And so those were the reasons I went.
I mean, what I find fascinating is, you've produced you invested in a few hits while you were at CRV, with, ClassPass and Patreon. It's interesting how I feel like if it was anyone else that kind of had that track record, then they would just, maybe stay in VC and I don't know, raise their fund based on that track record or, what have you. But they would kind of not think about, well, there's still this part of VC that I want to kind of learn and kind of explore, which is understanding like the operation side of the business. And so, I mean, just kudos to you about just not like kind of staying put and instead wanting to kind of explore and not, being, never being, kind of too comfortable, even though with the amount of success you had, it seems like you really had the option to kind of stay put and be comfortable.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. Yeah, it's funny. At the time, there were some good ones. There were ClassPass and Patreon, DoorDash. There were a couple others that we thought would be good, but ended up not being great, which is how early stage venture goes in terms of returns. Totally. Yeah, maybe it comes all the way back to it's not the best personality trait of mine, but I'm actually very uncomfortable being comfortable. And so it was not a hard decision for me to go and kind of try this like new risky thing, that I wanted to do it in kind of a risk adjusted way. Again, just how I'd kind of gone to venture because I had all of this financial aid I needed to kind of work out. I was thinking about what opportunity would I go to that was kind of risk adjusted. There's a reason I didn't go to a 4-person startup next.
What were some of your learnings while at CRV, since it seems like many of your winners were in, consumer marketplace type businesses, and then you ended up going to work at a consumer marketplace type business as well. But like, what were some of like your learnings from that experience from the investment side?
Yeah. I didn't know the first thing about venture. Like I owe a lot to the team at CRV that took a bet on me, which I'm not quite sure why they wouldn't have done that. But they did. And then they, over years, I think I earned their trust. And they earned mine, to work really well together. So I think that's actually one learning that I think about a lot now, being in a slightly different position at RedPoint, which is the trust of your team and how you collaborate together is really important in influencing kind of how you make decisions. So that's one. I think more related to what types of investments are interesting. Now we look at the data and say, okay, if we look with inside consumer, there are a lot of different types of consumer businesses. At the time, this was like 2012, 13, 14, there were a lot of CPG businesses being started. Some of them were subscription, like Dollar Shave Club, which is obviously a really big outcome. Most of them were just kind of brand new e-commerce brands. We didn't invest in any of those. And I think that was the right call in retrospect, because it was hard to pencil, like, how does this become a multi-billion-dollar company? I always say, like, I don't want to invest in any consumer business that has a TAM, like a total addressable market of less than about 40 billion, because I want to believe that company can be valued at $1 billion with less than 1% market penetration. And my back of the envelope consulting math, like, that's how I get there on kind of market TAM. And so the categories that we invested in were big categories. It was like, if this goes well in food delivery, there's a lot of people that will want delivered food. If this goes well in boutique exercise, or in exercise generally, fitness, like, there are a lot of people that will do that. If this goes well in, enabling creators to make money on a subscription basis, like, there's a lot of creators out there, like many, many millions of them. And when you looked at, like, well, if this goes well, then you sell, a lot of, like, bed sheets to somebody, or a lot of candles to somebody, or a lot of diapers to somebody. Like, the markets were just they were a little small, and also you had transactional revenue, as opposed to any kind of lock-in on a platform. So we ended up investing in mostly marketplace companies. Again, some of them that we just talked about ended up faring quite well. Several of them didn't. But marketplaces kind of became a thing that I got really excited about. And then from there, I also learned that the problems that every consumer business has are mostly supply chain problems, as it turns out. And so I ended up looking at the kind of, like, next level of behinds. Like, you have the brand here, but then it was like, well, what are the tools or products or platforms that power those brands? If you believe that Shopify is going to grow, if you believe that, like, Instagram is going to grow, if you believe that more and more people are going to want to be building their own businesses, like, what's that level of things? And I got really excited by some of these, like, logistics and supply chain businesses. Flexport was at the Series A, Convoy was at the Series A. I was spending time with those businesses. And then Uber Freight, which is what I ended up joining, was kind of just being put together inside of Uber for the first time. And that was the business that I ended up joining.
I appreciate you walking through why, as a type of business, why a marketplace business was very attractive when it comes to venture returns, as opposed to physical products, consumer brands, maybe kind of pure play consumer brands as well. On the TAM part, it's funny because we've had investors that are very kind of TAM focused and very kind of market, kind of maybe that, like, consulting background, I want to say, focus. We have also other investors that, like, don't even want to talk about TAM because, like, usually that the TAMs that they invest in are usually pretty small. And the idea is that they grow to become this large, they go, woo, and they grow these large numbers, and it's, the open sea and what happened. The blue ocean. How do you think about this when it comes to TAM, and actually measure TAM because that's the idea, right? That you hope that the market's actually small, but the market is growing at a really fast CAGR. So, like, how do you kind of how do you think about this question in terms of TAM?
Yeah, it's a great question. And whoever else was talking with you about that, I generally agree with them. I think about it, TAM, there's a defined TAM, right? So ClassPass, you would comp that probably to, like, personal training, or you would comp that to, like, gym memberships. Neither of those would get you to be big enough to invest in a company like ClassPass. So I actually would rebuild my own version of TAM and say, demographically, how many humans do I think there are that actually want to do this? Or I can say, like, yoga studios should be included in this, like SoulCycle should be included in this, half marathon should be included in this. Like, there's kind of like a long tail. Then you have, like, Pilates, and now you have rowing and Barry's Boot Camp, and, like, all these types of things, right? But there was kind of, like, all the things. There's no, like, TAM today that shows all of those things together. So you kind of, I think this is a fun part. Like, you kind of get to put it together and say, like, okay, if this is my TAM, which is not something I pulled from, like, a market research report or something, is this big enough? And that's when I say TAM, that's what I mean. Same thing with like, if you were to look at Uber's Series A and comp it to the black car market, you would have missed that one pretty big time. If you looked at Airbnb and were to comp it to, the hostel market, for example, you would have missed that one pretty big time too. And so those are, silly but very real examples. Even DoorDash, if you were to comp it to Grubhub at the time, you would have missed on how big it could be. Or like the market that we were looking at was how many restaurants today offer delivery. Turns out it's just pizzas. And the reason that they can do it is that pizzas actually will stay warm in like the sleeve in your car for long enough that they can afford to have a full-time delivery person. But every restaurant was constrained by front of house seating, not back of house kitchen capacity. So if you walked up and down and asked 5 restaurants, they would all tell you, yeah, I'd love to deliver, but like, I don't think I'm going to have the volume to merit hiring my full-time delivery person. You're like, oh, well, would you want to share a delivery person? And they're like, yeah, of course. And now we've seen how that kind of evolved. So for me, Tam, yeah, you should be able to dream the dream a little bit on it. But it is what kind of separates the companies that I think can be really good, kind of traditional venture returns from those that are great businesses and frankly, really fun to build. But for, funds that are in this size, multi-$100 million funds that are looking for, multi-billion-dollar hits, you have to believe that the kind of market is moving to a place where it could be really so big that you could have a foundational consumer company on the back of it.
Yeah, I mean that is, I think, a really interesting way to look at it in terms of where the market is right now and what are maybe some of the levers that need to happen in order for the market to actually grow. And like I like your ClassPass one too because it's like an aggregation of a lot of different types of kind of workout activities. I'd imagine like on the Patreon side, it's like, okay, how many kind of creators or people that are making content. I feel like that's growing. And so, yeah, anyway, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I remember we looked at the number of YouTube content creators that had over 1 million subscribers. And that's how we defined the TAM. I don't remember what that number was, but it was like, this number is much bigger and it's growing very quickly. And these people are making $67 a month based on ads revenue. Like, it seems like there's probably some other way to better align.
What led you to Uber? And why? And I know you want an operational experience. How did that come about? Why was Uber the right company?
Uber wasn't the right company. But I ended up taking, when it was all said and done, 5 months off between leaving CRV and joining Uber, which was about 5 more months than I thought I was going to take, 4 more months than I thought I was going to take. But I tend to approach any sort of big decision, a job or career decision being one of those. I make my best decisions when I have like real self clarity in my own head of what I'm looking for. And so I had a ranked order list of priorities of things that were important to me in a job. And that made it really easy for me to stay kind of honest with myself about what I was prioritizing and what I was not prioritizing. The biggest one on that list that I believe either has to be your number 1 or your number 5 of 5 in my case, is compensation or potential upside. At the time I joined Uber, tail end of 2016, beginning of 2017, it was already a big company. I mean, it was still private, but it was like, I could not have called it a startup if I tried, right? It was many thousands of people. And so that didn't hit my criteria of kind of really early product that could grow at like a non-linear, above linear rate. And that it was a company that I could join and be part of the executive leadership team. Neither of those things were going to be true if I was joining Uber at, I don't know how many thousands of people, 4,000 people maybe were there. But interestingly, there was this little group called Uber Freight that I'd gotten to know a couple of the people kind of while I was at CRV. They were starting a different company at the time. And I had spent, as I mentioned, a bunch of time with like companies like Flexport and Convoy and Samsara, and had like a real perspective on like, I think this B2B marketplace could be really big. Like, if you can do it for consumers getting rides, why can't you do it for truck drivers moving loads? That market is way bigger than the consumer market. And from a values alignment perspective, the life of a truck driver, of which I had some family members who were, is really tough. It is really, really, really tough. And I kind of love the idea of, wow, could you use technology in a marketplace model to improve their lives 1%, 5%, 10%, 50%? And what would kind of the downstream impacts of that be? And so for me, Uber was the wrong company, but Uber Freight was the right company. And it just happened to be getting built as a startup kind of inside this larger business. I ended up learning a tremendous amount, getting to be part of kind of Uber overall during that time, and have kind of front row seat to the rides business, to the eats business, to a few other things that were being kind of trialed at the time, but then also got this startup experience working in a tiny little office, pre-product, pre-revenue, and building the team from the ground up.
A number of things that are interesting is, on the surface, as you say, it looks like you're working for a very large company, which is very true. But your actual role was, making this was in this division that was actually very, very, very startup like, since you're building an entirely new product. Marketplace. And also, what's interesting is your past investing, and also even as a founder, was all kind of in consumer. And this was a stretch to actually build a market like more like the B2B side. And maybe with traction on the B2B, on the B side, maybe some exposure there as well. Even though I know you also work with Flex and Flexport and maybe other companies on that side. I know you were also at Uber during the big transition from Travis to Dara. Like, what was that also like from your perspective?
That's a great question. I was at Uber on the day that happened. That must have been like middle of 2017, probably. And it was just a crazy learning experience for me, because I was, there was an all hands that happened. And so, again, I don't know how many people were at Uber at the time, I should know, but I want to say it was like about 4,000. There are thousands of people at the company. And so there are some people who are in person, but there's offices around the world. Everyone's dialed in. I was sitting in a conference room with, I don't know, 20 or 30 other Uber Freight people. And we were watching this kind of live stream, all hands, where Travis got up there as he normally did during all hands, and I don't know, talked through any number of things. But the part I remember was then he said, I'm stepping down as CEO. And he said a bunch of really, I thought, very kind of kind and mature things about Dara. He said, this is a great person. I'm fully supportive of him being here. And then he introduced Dara, and then Dara came up, and Travis literally took a step back off stage, and Dara then kind of addressed the whole company all at once. And so watching that from my seat was very interesting, both to watch how it was done. And by the way, if you remember, like in the background, there was all this news coming out, right, about like the shitstorm that was going on, excuse my language, with like Travis and his board, and how Benchmark was like doing the worst thing any venture capitalist could do by like forcing this founder to leave his company. And I don't know, there was just like all this noise about it. And then we watched this very, cordial, well-orchestrated, seemingly honest kind of transition right in front of us. And so I remember then, like when the screen went off, the meeting's done, sitting in that room was actually where more learning took place for me, which is because in that mix of people, you had some people like me who were very new to the company. And so I had no reason not to like Travis, but I didn't have a personal, deep-seated allegiance to him in a way that many early Uber employees did, and potentially still do. And so the variation in response, I mean, people were crying, people were very upset, and other people were kind of like, cool, whatever, was also really interesting for me to see, and I think reflective of the journey that companies go on. Like early on, bringing it back full circle to the earlier conversation, like I've been a founder, I've been an early employee at a startup too. It is personal. it is wildly personal. Like you go through the ringer with these people and you stay up all night and you like pull your hair out together and they help you or they make you wildly successful. Or in Travis's case, they also make you like wildly financially successful, like for a bunch of reasons personally. There's like a really tight knit bond that's built there. And I think it's part of what makes working at an early stage company just one of the best experiences of all time. It is the hardest, but also the best. And then as a company grows, just by definition, like it gets a bit less personal, right? And people who are, there for different reasons end up joining, and you get further and further from that kind of really, human core. And then the job of leadership is to like, build a culture that can be extensible as a company grows, which is its own total different challenge that, I think frankly, Dara, at least while I was there, was starting to do a pretty good job of.
Did you see, and maybe because, you were in Fright, which was maybe different from, maybe Uber Core, did you notice on the transition, when it did transition from Travis to Dara, that there was maybe a change in however describe change as you'd like, but was there maybe a change in culture? Was there a change in kind of different parts that you saw, even in strategy, that you saw? Or was Freight kind of siloed where it didn't really, and you were kind of still a startup anyway, that there really wasn't, a lot of change from that end?
Well, our question was like, is Freight still important? Like Freight was important to Travis.
Yeah.
So is Freight important to Dara? Is he going to be like, what is going on with these like truck drivers? We're not a truck driver company. You should go to something else. So yes, it was highly relevant what was going on. And I remember going to sit down with Dara for the first time and bringing our plan for Freight, right? Which is a very expensive business to build. And saying like, we've got 3 versions of our plan. This is the one we think we should go down. And he asked us great questions, very pointedly in the first meeting. And we walked out. I think I personally felt like really impressed that he really understood the nuances of the business and he understood how big it could become. And he made it very clear that it was going to continue to be a priority for him and therefore for Uber for the foreseeable future. So yeah, it was definitely important to us, as individuals, and other things that changed. Culturally, some things changed very quickly, and Uber at the time also was not being written about very positively for its culture, and so how kind of ratings and reviews and performance compensation was done was changed tactically. And I think that trickled down then into kind of how some of the culture started to evolve.
You then leave Uber. What led you to RedPoint and kind of going back into VC? And then you felt that you had enough operational experience?
I had it was really funny. I don't know how it happened, but I had a tremendous amount of inbound from firms saying like, hey, you want to catch up about coming back into venture? And so the timing was very real. Like 5 years ago, it had been, we only want to hire somebody who's been at Twitter or Facebook. We have to have like a person who's been an operator for one of these 2 consumer social companies. And if you look, there was like a whole wave of people that got hired from those companies into venture. Some of them are still there. Some of them have chosen to do other things. But at that moment in time, that was the spec. And I really do believe that like, I just happened to be the spec. And so those were the 2 reasons I ended up leaving Uber to join RedPoint sooner than I expected. And I will talk for an endless amount of time about how I made that decision and how happy I am with the RedPoint team and all of that. But
yeah, I'd love to know what stood out from RedPoint amongst maybe the rest that you were considering.
So there were a few things I knew I wanted coming back to venture. It's like any job. Once you've done it once, you're going to ask slightly different, hopefully better questions to come back into that, right? Like you've done sales at one company, you're like, okay, didn't ask these questions. Let me ask these questions next time, right? Like you've been a PM at this company, you're going to ask different questions about being a PM at another company. And same thing, you've been a VC at one firm, you're going to ask different questions going back into VC because you understand the model a little bit differently. And so I felt like my questions were better. And I also had a whole bunch of friends who I'd gotten to know over many, many years in venture who were really valuable sounding boards for me and also had really valuable information for me of like what's going on in these places, really, really going on in these places. So what was important to me objectively, I wanted a place that did both consumer and enterprise early stage investing, that had access to growth, because I think there's a really valuable feedback loop between early and growth investing in terms of kind of learning and information sharing. And then I wanted one that was going to be based in San Francisco because at that point it was pretty clear for my life that I was going to be wanting to stay in the Bay Area. And then I didn't want to start my own firm, which we can talk about in a moment because that seems like all the rage these days. But I wanted to join a platform that was in the top quartile, moving in the right direction. Because some firms are in the top quartile, but they're moving in the wrong direction because they haven't managed a generational transition, because their recent portfolio is not very good, because the brand is really stale. Like, I don't know, there's a whole bunch of different reasons. And so I made a list of like every firm, crossed out, over 60% of them, took a picture of that list, sent it to 3 friends in venture and said, is this the world of opportunities? I think this is the world of opportunities. And then I went and talked to those firms, and RedPoint was on there, not because it was top of my list, but because it was like I don't know as much as I'd like to know about this place. I've had some friends who have worked there. They all seem to have good things to say about it. I know a few entrepreneurs who have been backed by RedPoint. They all have good things to say about it, but like I myself don't know the humans, all of them super well. And I wanted to go sort that out. So at the end of the day, I ended up joining RedPoint because it had all the things I was looking and hoping for. But most importantly, it was the people. It's like the culture of the place. It's very team oriented. If venture firms exist on a spectrum of a group of individuals on one side that kind of hunt like a pack of wolves, that's a model that works. And on the other side, you have a team that plays like a basketball team. That can work too. And for me, as an individual, you get a lot more out of me working as a team than in a kind of pack of wolves environment. And again, I don't mean to throw shade at that. It's just for me, I'm not well wired for that. Like I find internal competition quite stressful, and it slows me down instead of motivates me to be better. And so inside of RedPoint, I think we've got a really good thing going. The recent returns are incredible, and you have a team that has managed through the process of a generational transition, I think, really thoughtfully.
I know during your time at CRV, you only focused on consumer. And now at RedPoint, you're, if it's fair to say, more of a generalist. You invest in enterprise SaaS and also you invest in consumer technology. On the consumer technology part, how has that evolved in terms of what you look for versus, 5-6 years ago when you were at CRV? Then investing in like ClassPass and what have you. How has it evolved now? How do you think about like consumer tech right now in terms of what's investable?
Yeah, great question. I think the short answer is like I think about it more strategically. Early on, like I was just looking at deals, trying to like, my blinders were on like this. I'm literally holding my hands by my face, saying like I was just trying to can I run the math and dream the dream with these people that this becomes a really big company. And that was what I did all day, every day. And I loved it. It was so great. And now I'm part of a team that is what our job is. But my job, that's only a piece of what I do every day. And I frankly kind of miss it. I wish I could do it a little bit more. And so what do we look for in consumer, or the people who are maybe a little bit younger than I am, who are what I was 10 years ago at CRV? My goals are, find the big markets that ideally are not fully defined per our earlier conversation. Find the big trends, they're probably like we built the graphs, looked at the data. They're probably going to be marketplaces, networks, or subscriptions. Maybe those are kind of the only two models we look at these days. We're not looking at CPG. We're not looking at transactional revenue. Well, marketplaces can be transactional revenue, but you want them to have like high frequency transactional revenue, so it doesn't really feel transactional. And those are the areas we look at. I think there's been a wave of really successful consumer marketplace companies. We see far fewer of them now. There was a wave of consumer subscription businesses, things like Calm and Headspace and Peloton, that are, again, like there's been some good ones there. We still see some. So what is it, kind of what's next for consumer? We've seen a lot of Web3 consumer companies. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of Web3 everything over the last couple of years.
About to say.
Yeah, so that's maybe not a fair statement, but that's very, very different than what consumer was looking like when I was investing, back in CRV years ago.
I appreciate it. Well, Annie, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate it.
And there you have it. It was an absolute pleasure having Annie on the show. I hope you all enjoyed listening. If you also love this content and learning more about consumer startups and VC, subscribe to the newsletter at theconsumervc.substack.com, also available in show notes. Thanks for listening.